Hello to all the new people that have joined. We are going to be waiting just a couple more minutes before we get started. Feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A section here at the bottom of Zoom, and we'll get started shortly. So thank you all for joining. All right, let's get started. And anyone who arrives later can join us. So my name is Roxana. I am one of the co-founders of SoftServe. SoftServe is a game-based learning platform for teaching and tracking soft skills. Today we have Nicole all the way from New York City, and she will be lending her amazing perspective with us today. So I will pass it on to you, Nicole, to do a brief introduction about yourself, and we'll get into the questions.
Thanks, Roxana. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm sure most of everyone is in the comfort of their homes, as Roxana and I both are. So just a little bit of background on myself. I lead the innovation practice for Ipsos, which is a market research company. So just understanding what consumers are looking for, what they want, what they don't know they want, but they need, and helping brands to make that identification and develop products around that. I also am an adjunct professor for NYU, teaching digital analytics to graduate and executive students, as well as a part-time lecturer at Columbia University, again, teaching execs, particularly in the areas of analytics, data analysis. So I do a lot of work with older students or continuing education students to get them up and running and ready for sort of the next stage of their career or moving into the work world, going from a more traditional work environment to possibly, becoming a digital nomad or working in different regions versus having to come into a traditional work environment, and giving them sort of some of the tools that helps them do that.
That is so awesome. I'm so glad to have you here with us today. I mean, you are quite literally the expert in what I'm going to call now the remote economy. It's shifted so much for school, for work, for life, really. And I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on, what it's going to look like in the coming weeks and what it's going to look like kind of when we get back to our new normal. And so hopefully we'll discover some awesome perspectives from yourself and then our participants later on throughout this conversation. So once again, any questions that come up throughout the conversation between Nicole and I, please drop them in the Q&A section at the bottom. Even if we answer them later on, feel free to throw them in. And then we'll jump into a little bit of a demo for what SoftServe does and how it actually empowers people like yourselves to teach and track soft skills. And then we'll do a little game around that, and then we'll jump into the Q&A at the end. And so, yeah, looking forward to getting started on this. So, so my first question for you is, so we're seeing a lot of employers change the way they operate to be successful remote teams. How do you see that playing out in the future? What exactly is the 9-to-5 going to look like during this transition? And then afterwards, like, how are we going to see adjustments in the work-life balance whole space?
So it's an interesting question, right? Because this is a, obviously it's a global crisis, but it's also, a moment of learning for many organizations, as well as academic institutions. So the first thing I think it's important for future case studies and as employers analyze, what the future of work looks like, is to frame the current situation accurately. So, one of the things that I've told many brands and organizations is that right now, people are not working from home. They are not working remotely. They are at home during a crisis trying to work. And that's an important distinction as companies and institutions analyze this current situation and really think about what the future of work in their organizations is going to look like. The reason I point this out is because, a lot of the frameworks and the decisions are based on, profitability analysis. And this particular, experiment, so to speak, that we all find ourselves in with having to try and work in our homes is very, very different than a normal working at home situation. So I think first that's an important, clarification to make. But also it's not really a new model, right? So according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, at the end of 2019, over 26 million Americans worked remotely. And that equates to something like, pardon my math, like 16% of the total workforce. So working remotely, at least full or part-time. So we've seen, like, in a span of just a couple of decades, telework, as it's referred to many times, has evolved, and it's just going to continue to evolve. And the idea is really about understanding, how does telework help not just employers, but employees? And I think that one of the things that companies are going to start to see, particularly as things get back to or form into the new normal, is that many people are not going to want to move back into an office from a 9 to 5, even if they enjoyed it previously. Academia is not, institutions are not going to look the same after this, particularly as companies are investing in these softwares, these platforms, in order to move so many people from a traditional environment into a virtual one. So I think that it's important to understand what are some of the benefits, as well as the barriers of working remotely. And we've seen historically from research that, anywhere from, it helps employers from a cost saving perspective. So real estate, for instance, lowering absenteeism, increasing overall productivity, and then also looking at a reduction in voluntary turnover for people that have to leave the workforce for whatever reason, because they can't go into an office on a day-to-day basis. Yeah. So it also allows them to diversify their workforce. So when you think about distributed workforces, being able to, have individuals in certain regions or cities or countries where it may be, you may need someone on the ground because you have a key client there, or you have some sort of need, but at the end of the day, it's not enough validation to, rent an office space, to build up an entire workforce, to get a receptionist, to have sort of all of the infrastructure and investment that it takes to open an office. So I think companies are really going to start listening more to employees to understand what their needs are, while simultaneously thinking about how they can lower their operational costs and how working remotely helps to do that. So a very long-winded answer, I think the future looks much, much different than what we've seen historically in just the rapid change in attitudes and behaviors towards a distributed or remote workforce.
Yeah, I like that you made that distinction, because I don't think I've heard a lot of people make it, and I think it's really important, because you're right. This is, people working from home during a very, unknown, a little bit chaotic, a little bit anxiety inducing type of environment. And so it really isn't the best version of working from home that we will see. And I think that's important to keep in mind when you're maybe noticing things aren't functioning the way you're used to them functioning. Maybe you need additional tools to support your team. And that all will happen in due time. For my team, we've been remote for, I think we had an office for 3 months out of our entire time as a team. And there was definitely benefits from working together, but I found actually like giving myself and my team the flexibility to have their day set up the way that they need it to be, whether they need to go pick up their kids or whether they need to go to a doctor's appointment, or whether they just really find that working out at 2 p.m. in the afternoon is what they need to be happy and successful, that they can do that, and then come back to the rest of the day as they please. And so
Exactly.
so it's interesting that there's been this feedback from employees like, hey, we want a more dynamic, accommodating work environment that actually is representative of like the world we live in. And now that we're pushed into it, I think a lot of employers are like, oh, maybe this is actually a good thing. Like,
Yeah, and I really hope that that is sort of the, I hope that we're at this inflection point when organizations, after, going into crisis mode, right, is over, they really reflect to understand and listen to their workforce, to their students, to understand, is can work on a day-to-day basis be better, right? I think we all know that, 9 to 5 isn't necessarily beneficial for everyone. Some people are morning people. Some people are, they're prime in the afternoon. Some people would much more prefer to work late in the evening, right? And depending on what your job or your role is, many roles have that flexibility, right? So if you are, I've been very fortunate in the fact that because I have to travel so much, I'm sort of just innately used to, being able to work on an airplane, a train, being able to work in the car, assuming I'm not driving. But it's really having that flexibility and being able to kind of turn on when I know that, I'm at my optimal sort of focus point versus having to wake up at like a 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning when nobody should have to deal with me at that point. And it really takes me a while to get going. So I think it's about understanding what the individual needs of employees are, and then trying to have enough flexibility in your organization in order to understand what role they fit best in and what the day-to-day work is that's optimal for them.
yeah. Well, it's funny because I'm so used to talking about soft skill development for students and employees that like really in this moment, what we're talking about is like those soft skills from employers, like having the flexibility to actually accommodate and trust their employees, having that like open communication, like seeing it from their perspective, using empathy. It's not usually the perspective we take, but it's interesting that that's in fact something that's going to be forced to happen. And I think a lot of people are going to be really happy. And I hope that it really allows, like you said, the diversity of employees, whether it's employees with disabilities or just like global, access to opportunities that once weren't available, right? And so I think that's really going to just for everyone take it up a notch and hopefully create those options for people that once weren't there. So,
Yeah.
okay. So moving on to the next question that I'm really excited to learn a lot about. So we've talked before, previous to this call, and I know you're working on a paper right now. And you briefly mentioned to me some of the challenges around remote working that during your research came to light, and whether it was with students or whether it was with employees. Can you share some of those challenges and if you have any solutions at this point, what you would recommend?
Absolutely. So, I mean, so the key takeaway from this I want to stress is that there's an overwhelming amount of research that shows from both an employee slash student perspective, as well as from an institution or organizational perspective, that there are incremental gains in order to optimize your workforce for the ability to work either part or full time in a remote or telecommuting environment. But obviously, nothing goes without having challenges, right? And some of the areas that I've seen in the research that, there are drawbacks that you have to think about and be cognizant of is specifically around areas like sort of social and social and professional like isolation. And again, this depends on the individual, it depends on the circumstances, but that's one of the areas that we hear can be a drawback to having this telecommuting element. Also, many people have said they feel like there are fewer opportunities for information sharing. And one of the key things I've seen, which I'm elaborating more in the paper on, is really blurring the boundaries between having that work and professional life. So, you know, if you're working, let's say, in your home, you don't really get to say, okay, well, I am now going to shut my computer down. I'm going to leave the office. I'm going to go home or to my quiet space, my transition space, and move back into my personal environment. So and I don't think that these are areas that are not able to be overcome. I just think that these challenges are important for organizations to understand when they start to build programs and transition people from going from an in-office lifestyle to having the ability to telecommute, and just building these programs appropriately in order to mitigate any of these challenges that can come up. So we've seen, for instance, you know, while trying to work at home during a crisis, you know, professional and social isolation. Well, that's technically what we all find ourselves in right now, because it's really hard to get around that, right? If you are going outside, let's say for a walk, but you know that you really need to stay isolated from others, 6 feet away, etc. It's one of the challenging things that's occurring right now. So it's really about thinking about how do you keep in contact, you know, and there's that balance between everyone's moving to an uncomfortable environment. So everyone's kind of over communicating right now. Yeah. So particularly if you think about, you know, your department heads or your managers, are they now like communicating with you more in the last 2 weeks than they have in like the last 2 months? And just thinking about that balance, right? So it's about making sure that, you know, you're checking in with your team, your workforce, but simultaneously providing them with the information, the documentation, having things digitized so that they're easily accessible based on different levels of access to the workforce as a whole, no matter where you are, how you access it, and just having sort of that balance between information free flowing and sharing, having that transparency on this is how the organization, this is how the team is doing, but also just making sure that you have social time set up so that people don't feel like they're in isolated situations. And that could be something as simplistic as virtual book clubs. It could be, you know, Friday virtual happy hours. I have to say, I have been invited to more virtual happy hours in the last 3 weeks than I think I've ever been invited to in the real world. So it's been very interesting. But it's interesting to just see how people are acclimating to this new environment. And it's trial and error at the end of the day. So one of the key things, or one of the key takeaways in the paper is to be cognizant and understand your team. And this is important whether you're moving into a telecommuting environment or if you're in a day-to-day situation where you're working with people face-to-face, right? Understanding and knowing your team, understanding the needs of your company, and then building for the outcomes that you want in an appropriate way, I think is important. And it's going to be a hurdle for a lot of companies, particularly companies that are legacy and aren't necessarily built on the model of telecommuting. So for instance, Anil Dash, a colleague of a friend of mine and former colleague, leads a company that is built 100% on telecommuting. His workforce is distributed across multiple cities and regions, and he has built the organization through the framework of transparency, pay transparency, platform transparency, having access to everything you need, no matter where you are, and also just making sure that people understand, his team understands how to access everyone at any given time, you know, during appropriate work hours, and how to have those communications. And I think that's going to be a huge learning, particularly for academia, which you don't always have that transparency similar to how you do with sort of private/public, organizations.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think the education space is going to really, like, I really hate using the word reform, but I think there's going to be a lot of changes happening for the better. And I hope that it really allows for that kind of back and forth experience. Like, it's been a long time since I've been in university now, but I started off at a smaller college and then I transferred to a bigger university, Simon Fraser University here in Vancouver, if anyone's heard of it. And there were pros and cons to both. Like when I was at the smaller university, I actually like knew my professors. It was like 30 people in a classroom. I knew my classmates, and it was really like intimate, like I felt very comfortable being able to reach out and connect with them. And then when I transferred to the large university, I think I would know like one or two people in my class of like 300-400 people. I barely knew my professor, but there were so many more extracurricular opportunities because of the scale of the university. So it'll be really nice to see like maybe a hybrid of both now. Maybe opportunities can be cross university, who knows? But I think it'll be a really nice change, and I think it's so needed, right? When you see how the world is evolving, this change was necessary, and I think that like it would have taken a longer time had it not been for this crisis. But now that we are here, I think a lot of people are going to start seeing the value. And and like we said earlier, like it's just so hard to change that behavior backwards, especially when you start to see profitability. You're not dealing with real estate anymore. When you start to see happier employees, when you start to see, more innovative ideas. And I think all of that comes with changes where people aren't commuting to the office. I used to commute 3 hours back and forth, like an hour and a half each way. And I was in my 20s. I think I could not do that again.
Please tell me you were in 20s, because I can only imagine doing that in my 20s, because after that, I'm like, you know what? This is absurd. Like, just that long of a commute is insane, especially when in today's day and age, when there are so many alternatives, depending on the profession that you're in, obviously. So if you are a nurse, you still would have to commute, obviously, unless you're in telemedicine. But I do think that, it's amazing with all the advancements and all the, opportunities that we have, particularly when, if you are in a profession or a role where, if something isn't absolutely necessary, like if you don't have to move from point A to point B in order to deliver your optimal performance and deliverables, then there's no reason you should. But there's also unique benefits of being able to have virtual environments, for, the larger society, for individuals with needs that for some reason they can't physically come to a location. They can't physically, join or participate in non-virtual events, for instance, whether it's because they have special needs, because, they're late, their babysitter canceled, they can't get to a particular area. There's just so many reasons why having the opportunity to not have to go to a traditional work environment is beneficial for everyone involved. But simultaneously, having the option of being able to still have more traditional frameworks and, an office environment that's possibly smaller for people who do feel the need, or if there's moments in time where you do all need to get together, face to face and interact.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we can go back to your experience as a professor, a lecturer, do you find that, like, one, do you expect students to come in with soft skills at a certain level of proficiency? And what's your, and how does your expectation compare to like the reality?
So I've been teaching now for probably, I want to say 9 years. So I think that my expectations now have adjusted to what the reality is. But I will say it's just very different. It's very different across the board. So one of the amazing things that I'm able to do is I teach a very diverse set of students, whether they be graduate students or at the executive level. So my students usually come from, I think the class I'm teaching now has something like, they come from 35, 36 different countries,
Wow.
which is, absolutely an amazing privilege to be able to, teach folks with such different perspectives. But again, that also means that they come in with looking at things through a different lens, right? So their version of a soft skill may be different than someone else's version of a soft skill, or how they interpret or execute on those skills. So I will say that I expect individuals to come into my class with some soft skills, but I think that it's something that forms, right? Because there are different norms based on where you are. There are
Right.
different, guidelines. There are different just frameworks that you adapt to as a human, as an individual. So soft skills are extremely important. I hope for the most part that my students come into my class with empathy for others, empathy for the environment that they're in, understanding that, the speed of learning for different people can be very different. But at the same time, not everybody comes in with, the same level of emotional intelligence. Not everybody comes in with the ability to communicate the same, having that, some people are introverts, some people are extroverts. They may be extremely empathetic, they may be brilliant individuals, but they may not necessarily have the same level of skill when it comes to, articulating their thoughts, articulating their feelings, and just having, being able to recognize that, I think, is the first step in being able to teach any classroom based on the way that individuals need to be taught. Because learning is while it's a group exercise, you usually don't teach just one-on-one.
Right.
There are so many different elements of individualization. So I'm very thankful that I actually have relatively small classes. In the US, that's usually like less than 30 people. But so I don't have to teach, MOOCs or absolutely huge classrooms. So I try and cater, or flex based on individual needs. But at the same time, it is important to get individuals comfortable with at least being able to feel comfortable in the environment they're in and interact in the best way possible with one another. Because when you get out into the work world, I don't care if you are a salesperson, business development, or if you're an engineer, a data scientist, you will in some way, shape, or form have to communicate with another individual. So you don't always get to just write code, in the privacy of your home. And,
Yeah.
you have to have those communication skills. And I think that is one of the most important elements when it comes to soft skills, of being able to articulate, being comfortable enough with yourself and the environment that you're in order to make those connections.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. I think empathy and communication are like, if you have to pick a set of soft skills to lead with, those are the ones that I would say are probably the most important. And another thing that you said that I thought was really interesting and has come across in some of our research is, the international component, right? Like, we live in such a globalized world that's only going to become more and more global. And you have so many different perspectives of values and culture and just language, right? Like, I'm sure for the people who speak multiple languages, like, stuff doesn't just translate. Like, the loss to translation is real, and there's things that you feel and you don't know how to say or can't say in a different language. And I think it's so important to get everybody on the same page and actually, like, understanding the problem at hand, from from the same lens, or at least being able to see it from another lens. And I think empathy is so instrumental in getting there. And then communication follows that, when you can actually express how you see something, and now all of a sudden your own soft skill development is actually developing someone else's skill, and you have this like amazing synergy, right?
Exactly.
I'm sure that's probably like the optimal environment for learning.
It absolutely is. I mean, as a professor, I can only do so much. I truly believe that having a safe environment that you feel comfortable in is really optimal, because most individuals learn through peer-to-peer learning, right? So I can obviously give information. I can talk about the path of learning. I can give instructions. But at the end of the day, usually peer-to-peer learning and communication and being able to have those interactions with your other individuals in the classroom is so important in order to practice and cement the knowledge that you're given by a professor or teacher or any instructor.
Yeah, I really do see like, educators like a lot like coaches, and like they're the, kind of expert in the subject at hand, but really it's like you're, passing the ball to them, so to speak, the knowledge ball. And then the plays happen between the students. And that's where you really develop those skills, and then taking it back to the workplace, right? Which is like, okay, if you have positive, like project-based learning experiences, team learning, your classmates, then you're going to bring those skills, to the workforce. And I think you're probably seeing a lot of this. We're probably been preaching a lot of this for a long time, that these are actually probably the most important skills that students hopefully can take to the workplace. Like the knowledge they have, like I have a degree in psychology, and it's awesome. I love psychology, but really what I have been able to take from my time at university was the ability to collaborate, the ability to create research and communicate with people, understand their perspective, the ability to network, build relationships with like senior professors, even when I'm like nervous and feel like, oh, how do I navigate this, right? And, that's foundational to me, and I'm sure a lot of other people. So, yeah, I guess this is such a good conversation. We only have time for like one more question. Okay. I guess I'll ask. Okay, so this is the one that I have here. So okay, so innovation it differs a lot from digitization, right? And so what I think is happening right now, is you very well put, in crisis mode, is a lot of things are just being digitized. And by that I mean like we're replicating the workplace digitally, because that is probably the first step in just getting into this whole world, right? And so my question for you is, so once we get past the digitization, how will we be incorporating innovative solutions using technology that aren't just replicating, but enhancing the work from home experience specifically for that? If that makes sense.
No, it does. So I mean, so let's be clear. My background is in tech. I work in the digital environment all the time. But at the end of the day, technology is an enabler, right? That's all it is. It helps you get to a particular outcome that you're looking to get to. So to me, what was the word you?
I said digitization, which I hope is a word.
Yes. Digitization is, in my mind, it's just creating a virtual mirror of what we see, do, and feel in our everyday lives, right? So this is sort of digitization to me is just a necessary first step in order to ensure, let's call it equitable access to people wherever they are on demand, right? So, but digitization doesn't solve problems. Innovation should solve problems. So if you think about innovation through tech-enabled solutions, right? It should take away the issues that you face, but it should also preempt the issues that tech can bring about. So let me give an example of what I'm thinking of, right? So if I am teaching a class at NYU and my class is in downtown New York at 6 p.m., right, on Wednesdays,
Right.
then that means that you have to physically be able to come to that classroom. So, if you're running late for a meeting, if your babysitter decided that they can't show up, if you are let's say disabled or immobile, if you have a fear of crowds or groups, right? There are all kinds of barriers, or you're just not geographically located in New York. There are all kinds of barriers that can get you into that classroom at 6 p.m. on a Wednesday, right? So then if I say, okay, I'm going to digitize my class. So I'm going to take all of the learnings, I've recorded all of my seminars, I'm going to get a digital book, I'm going to put all of that information online so people can access it on demand, anywhere, anytime. It also goes from this classroom can only fit 20 people to this, digital environment can, millions of people can access it. But if I move everything to a digital environment, there's still issues, right? There's the assumption that everyone can, let's say, number one, afford the class, assuming it's paid for. There's an issue with saying that everybody has a laptop or an iPad or some technological device to get online. There's the assumption that people have access to the internet.
Right.
There's also the assumption that even if you have access to the internet, you have the money to pay for the class, you have, an amazing brand new Mac, there still could be a hurdle from the ability to understand, how do I now set this all up in order to be productive, in order to get the most I can from this digital environment. So to me, innovation is supposed to bridge that gap between the hurdles in the offline environment and the hurdles in the online environment, in order to provide people access, to allow people to overcome the hurdle of uh, uh, learning hurdles, right? How do I get online? How do I have access? Um, I feel like innovation should really look at what are all of the problem cases that could be, and alleviate those in order to give the greatest majority of individuals access to that digitized environment. And true innovation looks at all of those problem cases, preempts them, and then backs out and delivers a clear path for bringing people into the environment in a successful way. And one of the things that when this crisis first started, and I apologize if I'm going over time, but this kind of jumped into my head, and it really bothered me at the time. And I thought, how many more kids is this happening to? But when COVID really started to become an issue here in New York, and schools, rightly so, closed down, and they really thought, how could we make kids successful? So we'll give them iPads. Okay, brilliant. All the kids now have iPads. So you've gotten over that hurdle of, I don't have access to technology to get online. The Times did an article on a little girl who super excited about learning, which you hope all little girls and boys are. And she had gotten her iPad, and she opened it up, and she was about to go online, and she realized she didn't have access to the internet. She was actually living in a homeless shelter at the time, or currently. And it's something that she couldn't run out to a Starbucks, right? Because that's what we do if our internet is down. She couldn't run to a Starbucks because time of crisis, everything is closed. She couldn't go to a friend's house. So it's again, thinking about how could things go wrong and preparing for it. I mean, obviously this is happening in crisis mode, so it's much harder to do that. But now that we know, like, these are some of the long-term builds that we have to think about post-crisis, how do we plan appropriately? How do we ensure that children, of young people of all ages, adults, how do we ensure they have the access that they need? And that, to me, is where innovation comes into play. Strategy and problem solving, and really developing the right path forward to not just digitize something, but to have equitable access to that digitized environment.
Yeah, I love equitable access. I'm gonna coin that, or I'm gonna not coin it. I'm gonna use it, and then I'm definitely gonna credit you for coining it. But no, I think that's so important, and it really sounds like a lot of what I learned about design thinking, when you're creating a solution, you need to focus on the users
Yeah.
and what they're going to be experiencing, and how it's going to actually affect their ability to interact with your solution, right? And again, that comes back to being able to empathize and understand the various different parts of the user journey, and making sure that your solution doesn't just solve one thing and create 9 other problems, right? And of
Exactly.
course, there's always going to be a give and take, but I think if you actually put like the innovative mindset to creating a solution that is tech enabled, but not just mirroring tech, the current environment, that you'll be successful. And I hope to see a lot of that happening, and I'm sure we will. I mean, right now everyone's just trying to figure out how they can adapt in the situation, and get their students and employees ready for success. So thank you so much. That was very well put. I'm going to quickly jump into showing you guys what SoftServe's about. And I'm sure Nicole's probably excited to see this, because
Yeah.
we connected, oh my gosh, I think it was like 2 years ago now, back when we had hopes of launching a podcast that did not go anywhere. But we were talking about these same things with soft skills, and how do we bring this to students and employees in a meaningful way that's scalable, that's actually tracking their progress. So I'm just going to quickly share my screen with everyone, and then we will jump into the Q&A. I see there's 2 responses here, so feel free to add yours. Perfect. I'm just going to send that here. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So what I'm showing you here is the dashboard for educators. And what it allows you to do is host games that actually teach empathy, curiosity, creativity. So if we go to start a game, and the first game that we have is called Queue Up, which was named by our amazing students that we tested this out with. And the reason they called it that is because it's questioning up. And so you basically are given a problem statement. So as an educator, I can either pick from one of the pre-populated problem statements here, or I can create my own problem statement. And the reason we added the create your own problem statement option is we really want to make it so that you can integrate your curriculum, your existing curriculum, into the game, and so that now you have your students empathizing, being creative, and curious about the content at hand. So whether you're teaching about governments and you're trying to have your students understand the implications of a totalitarian government, or whether you're trying to like get a physics concept across in like an exciting, fun way. So let's say we create our own problem statement, and I'm gonna say teaching soft skills is hard. Super easy. You go to the next section here, and you'll see here that there's each of the words you put in for your problem statement are bubbled. And what you want to do is select the words that will be forbidden. And what that means is your students can't use them in their response of who cares and why they care that teaching soft skills is hard. And the reason that we did this is we found during our research that if you remove the subject from the problem statement, which can be a positive or a negative, that you're actually encouraging the students to now empathize with the problem, and actually take it from the perspective of maybe somebody else, not themselves. Maybe in this case, they're going to think about it from the perspective of the teacher, or another student, or the institution that they're a part of. So you create your problem statement, and you then create your coach ID, and you share this with your students. They connect to it, and you can see your students joining here. Once you have all your active players here, so if I had actually shared this code with somebody, you would see them all populating here, and then you would go finish and start your game. And so we have no students right now, so we can't start a game, but that's basically our platform, and it's super exciting for us. We're launching next week. I know we have some educators here, so we would love to pilot this with you guys. If you're interested, I'll send an email afterwards, but that's what we're working on. We're really passionate about being able to empower educators to teach soft skills and actually integrate classroom content in a fun, gamified way. And so let's move on to the Q&A now. If you have any more questions, feel free to drop them, but I'll start with the first one that we have.
Jana, before we jump into questions, I just have to say that I work with like senior level executives, and quite frankly, I want to use this with my teams. No, seriously, because I think it's actually, first of all, I love anything that's gamified. This reminds me of, I can't remember the game, Categories maybe?
Oh, yeah.
You're trying to get some, but you can't say certain words on the list.
Yeah.
And I love that. So, but this would even work, I feel like, for in the workplace, so empathy and soft skills, quite frankly, is something that we still teach from a learning perspective to executives. So being much more conscientious of, like, let's say diversity and inclusion, thinking about, unconscious bias, looking at, skills around communication, particularly as companies go global. So yeah, so we might have to talk about this more in just a separate element of leveraging this for employers in general. So
we would be honored to work with you and your students and in any capacity. So yes, thank you so much for that. That means the world to us. I mean, for us, it's so important that people like yourselves who would be using a product like this see the value, that it's easy, that it actually like helps. It doesn't add more work to your existing, to-do lists of things. So thank you. And we'll chat afterwards. And anyone else is interested, we are looking for 10 schools to partner with. We had a bunch of interest from yesterday's demo, so don't be shy and let us know, because we are very excited to work with people like yourselves who see the value and go out of your way to attend webinars like this and add to the community. So thank you. All right, so our first question is from Tetsu, and it says, what type of adjustments would you recommend to make up for the face-to-face interactions, especially for professors? For example, when you're giving a face-to-face lecture, you can read the audience. That would be really hard, if not impossible, for one big group. Any advice?
No, so that's a good question. Who did you say that was from? Tetsu? Tetsu. So thank you for your question. So so I will say this. I've unfortunately taught lecture halls, right, where there's 100 individuals in one room and it's all face to face. And I can assure you, I could not read the faces because the lights were in my eyes and it was really hard to communicate. But I do understand what you mean when you moved from, let's say, a class of 15 people in person to 15 people online. So as a basic functionality, every university is different. For Columbia and NYU, we use Zoom, which I think actually just is brilliant. I think it has amazing functionality. Maybe one or two privacy concerns, but that's another webinar. But I will say that my default is every student must have their video on at the beginning, through the duration of class. You must have your video on. There's no reason not to. If you have an iPad, if you have a phone, if you have a laptop, they all have webcam built into them. So that shouldn't be a hurdle in any way, shape, or form. If you're on an electronic device, you have a camera. The reason I think this is really important, if you're using Zoom, I can see all of my students at once. So obviously the larger your class size is, the more difficult that becomes, but you can legitimately see 60 people at one time on the Zoom platform, which is really beneficial. The reason why is because, again, if all the students have their video on, you do see that interaction, right? Especially if you're asking them to respond. If you're seeing people, if you're seeing students like kind of do the head nod and like they're dozing off, or if you see students like nodding their head, those are just sort of simple human characteristics that you even see a lot with children. So I think it's important to have the visual component. Also, one of the things that I try and do is mimic as much as possible that online or that virtual environment. So for instance, if let's say one of the important elements in your class is to have breakout sessions, so you can have smaller groups, let's say 3 students working with one another versus, let's say, a group of 30, where it gets really difficult because if everyone's not on mute, you have a lot of background noise. in Zoom as well as in Blackboard, you're able to do breakout sessions. So you can actually, in the functionality, you can assign, let's say you have, let me do an even number because I can't do math that well. So if you have 8 students and you want to have like, 4 students in each, you can do 2 breakout sessions. And that really just helps to kind of mimic the same offline to online components that you would have in the actual classroom. Again, also having uh, uh, office hours is really important. So I offer students office hours where, again, they have their video on. We have conversations just like this. So how you can see Rakshana and myself, and we would be having a conversation. That's our office hours. And that way you still get eye contact. You still get some, the engagement level. And I think that's really important.
Yeah.
So hopefully I answered the question.
Hopefully. I mean, I think that was a very good response. And one of the actually professors from the other webinar that is bringing it to their classroom, what they want to do is actually use this game SoftServe as a check-in point. So at the end, like every time they kind of finish off like a section of the curriculum for that day, let's say they've broken it off into 4 parts, they then can run a quick game that lasts like 5 minutes to actually get a sense of what like the students are feeling about the break-off session, and what their opinion on the topic is, right? Especially when it comes to something that's like in the business or political science or something where there's a lot of like opinions to be had about the topic at hand. So integrating different like kind of, I guess, games or engagement tools.
I love that because you're taking sort of a pulse in the beginning of the session and then a pulse at the end to see if the outcome that you were hoping for, let's say a slight increase in EQ or empathy, is happening at the end of that session, to make sure that you can quantify the learning experience.
Yeah, I love the term like taking the pulse, because you totally could ask a question in the beginning, see what your students think about it, and then go into the curriculum for that day, get that pulse again after you've kind of provided context,
Exactly.
see how their opinion has changed or hasn't, right? And I think just being able, and also for students, right, because they can now see how they've responded before and after, and it like validates the education they're receiving, and it allows them to see in real time like what they've learned and like that is happening.
Exactly.
Okay, our second and last question is from Antoine Wade. How important is adaptation of soft skills now that the majority of the world has to adapt to this new way of life and work? How would you measure that in the workforce?
So I do think soft skills are quantifiable. So, I mean, for instance, so I talk a lot because I'm part of the executive leadership team for my organization. So I talk a lot about, senior leaders and having empathy, because again, most program changes, most execution has to sit with, if senior leadership doesn't have sort of the EQ or the empathy in order to understand their workforce, then these programs don't even actually come into effect, right? Because they're not thinking about what the impact is on the workforce as a whole. So I look at it amongst executive leaders a lot, just being able to say, like, after you're, similar to what Roxana just mentioned about being able to quantify through the system, pre and post learning experience. So I do think that's important, because I should be able to measure through third-party softwares about increased productivity, right? Increased productivity isn't just your general output, it's how do you communicate with one another? Are you actively reaching out to your team? Are you still able to manage up as well as down and laterally? Are you being communicative, and is your communication effective to the larger team? So all of that you can get a read on an ongoing basis. So one of the things I'm very anti is when people have like annual reviews. An annual review is meaningless, in my point, right? It really should be like a constant check-in, because you can't tell me at the end of the year that, oh, remember back in February of 2019, this project didn't go well, and you're telling me this in December. So
Right.
it's really about being able to measure in the moment about those behavior changes, whether increased or decreased in productivity, and having sort of that general pulse across the organization to see where some people may be falling short. Maybe it's on the communication perspective. It doesn't mean that they're not good at communication in this virtual or remote workforce. It simply could mean that they might be having more of a challenge overcoming technology or being comfortable on video chat, or if they have kids that are being homeschooled, that they're finding difficulty in the balance. So it's really about just having a pulse across all of your employees to understand, where does someone need more assistance or help or training or support, and how do I proactively give that to them, versus it just being a general nick against them when it comes time for reviews. So I do think that all of it is quantifiable. You just have to look at the outcomes that you want to measure. So if it's a soft skill, how do people show empathy for one another, right? I can measure that technically in a face-to-face work environment. If a manager doesn't understand sometimes when that you're better working in the morning than the evening, right? They don't have that empathy. Or if you're trying to pre-plan things where you're like, I can't work on Fridays, but I'm willing to front load my schedule. Is there a way that we can make adaptations and pivot the team in order to, I'll cover someone on a Monday, they'll cover me on a Friday. So that in and of itself in a face-to-face work environment is measurable and quantifiable. And it's really taking into account flexibility and empathy on the part of a manager. That you can move into a virtual environment and also measure. I just think there might be different metrics when you move to remote work versus in-person work, but I think a lot of it scales and is duplicatable outside of just a traditional working environment.
That's so interesting. And like while you were talking, I couldn't help but think like the traditional traditional like a few weeks ago.
I
um,
know.
the traditional workplace, it really was measuring hours in
Mhm.
the space. And I think there was, and I feel like that's unfair to say that was the only metric, but like that was a huge part of, how you were evaluated. Like, were you in the office? Were you late? And did you achieve your outcomes? And I think, and I've always been a huge advocate of results driven, as opposed to how many hours you work. And of course you need to be mindful of that too, because you don't want employees that are really want to be successful but they're working 24 hours a day, right? And then
Yeah.
but at the same time, if it takes you 10 hours to accomplish something, or you prefer to accomplish it in 10 hours rather than cramming it into 7 hours, then you should be able to do that. And like on the other end of that spectrum, if you can get your work done in 5 hours, awesome. And I just think if anyone has ever done contract work or project-based work, that really is the model. And it's motivating, right? Like if you accomplish your work in the time in a quicker time span, and it's at the same level that it needs to be, then and that motivates you, then that should be something you're able to do. And I imagine we're going to see a lot of that happening.
Absolutely. And at the end of the day, it's perception, right? You really don't get companies or even academic institutions saying, oh my God, you're a salaried employee and you've worked 80 hours this week. This is just unacceptable, right? But you do get people that say you're a salaried employee and you've only like shown up, that I've seen you for 10 hours, right? Even if you've gotten everything done above and beyond what you're expected to. So it's changing perceptions. And I think, as we see sort of, as we see the shift from generation to generation and what the norm is for sort of this next generation coming into management, we really start to see these culture shifts, right? It's based on perception of results versus time spent. So if it takes you 5 hours to get what I expect from you done, then kudos, and I think it's really, or if it takes longer, then that's absolutely fine, because you may need more time to, execute. And even if you think of academia, it's very similar.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, I have to teach X amount of hours to my students, right? Even if my students are really smart and I'm articulate and succinct and I can convey that same information within the span of less hours, right? But there's so many criteria that are specifically based on time spent versus outcome driven.
So accurate. I think that's a perfect note to end this very, very, very exciting webinar. I feel like I could just talk to you, Nicole, for hours, and well, I'll have to invite you to a happy hour, and then
Yes, virtual happy hour in the short term.
but thank you so much. This was so
Thanks for having
informative.
me.
Oh, anytime, I think the work you're doing is so important, and really it's going to manifest, in this remote economy. And I think people are really going to start to, activate a lot of the stuff that you've known for so long and that you've been working towards. So again, I will email everyone a link to this webinar if you want to watch it again or share it, and then also a link to be a demo school if you're interested. And then Nicole, you and I will connect about working with the schools that you're working with as well. Thank you so much to everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank
Bye.
you all for joining. Bye.